Welcome to the Windmill Cultural Center in the heart of Fulton, a place where history, craftsmanship, and culture come together in a truly fascinating way. Inside this unique museum, you'll find an incredible international collection of windmill and watermill models from around the world. Each one is built to scale and crafted with remarkable detail by a Dutch craftsman who grew up in the Netherlands, a country famous for its iconic windmills and rich milling heritage. Today, we're joined by Jane Orman-Luker as she takes us on a guided tour through this one-of-a-kind exhibit.
Welcome to the Windmill Cultural Center. We're really delighted that you're here today. What you're going to see is a collection of international wind and watermill museums, scale model. None of them are from a kit, they are all from scratch. They were built by a Dutchman who grew up in the Netherlands and retired to the United States. And he brought many of the mills with him that he had built while he was living in Belgium. So we're going to show you some of those mills today, and we'll show you how some of them work. This first windmill is fashioned after a windmill that sits on Long Island, New York. That was built in 1804, and it remains there yet today. It is not a functional windmill, but it is still there. It's unusual because it has two sets of grinding stones. Most windmills just have one. It also has a set of governors. Those little balls are called governors for this set of stones, and there's another set back here for that set. Those are actually controlled by the speed of the wind. The faster the wind goes, the faster the sails go, and the further apart those governors get. That actually controls the level of the grinding stones. So the closer the stones get, the quicker the grain goes through and it doesn't burn as it's being ground. Another unusual feature on this one is the fact that we lubricate it with the same ingredients that we lubricate the windmill across the street: hog fat, sheep fat, and beeswax. I'll now turn this one on so you can actually see it functioning. One of the questions often asked, could they grind two different kinds of grain at the same time? And the answer is yes. This is probably one of the most unusual windmills in the collection. This one actually is from Iran. They no longer exist, but when they did, they were very unique. They needed winds of 45 to 70 miles an hour to even make them operate. It's called a horizontal windmill, and it operates much like a revolving door. So, of course, the grinding took place down below. But with that kind of wind, of course, it would go at a very high rate of speed. As I said, none of these exist any longer, and they probably never will be reconstructed. They were made from mud and fiber, and they sat out on the desert in Iran. The next windmill is actually one from Russia. You'll notice that it has 6 solid wood sails. That one has a staircase behind. That's what turns that windmill. So whenever the miller wanted to reposition the sails because the wind changed directions, he would actually have to go out, lift up that staircase, and then walk that around. And that was his only way to change the position of the sails. And of course, the sails have to be turned into the direction of the wind at all times in order to be functional. Now, I thought Russia having windmills, I guess I think of Dr. Zhivago and snow, but Russia actually does have a growing season, and it is the same as ours. So they do continue to use those kinds of windmills in Russia. This is a mill from the Netherlands. The Dutch have actually reclaimed about a third of their total land mass from the North Sea. So there is a saying, God made the world, but the Dutch made Holland. And that's the reason, because of their reclamation and their water management. The Dutch would take an area like this that had water in it, sometimes more than this, and then they would build a dike along. Then that dike was just like the dike that we have across the street that keeps the Mississippi River from us. Back here, they would construct a canal. So they would pump the water out of this low-lying area up into that canal, and then when that land was dry enough, they could farm it or they could build homes on it, whatever they choose to do. So this is a windmill that powers a water wheel. So the water wheel is actually the important part on this particular one. This is called the capstan wheel, and that capstan wheel is what is responsible for actually rotating the position of the windmill and changing the direction, because you always have to keep the sails turned into the mill. You'll notice that the interior parts here are just like what we have across the street. There's the big brake wheel, then there are the cogs that interface with some spindles. That actually comes down and turns that king spindle, it's called, and on this mill, it turns the water wheel. On the mill across the street, it turns the grinding stones. So I'll turn this one on for you as well. The construction of this windmill took Mr. Helema 800 hours. So you can see he certainly had a penchant for his hobby. Here we have a mill from Germany. This one is very unusual, and it shows very well what the millers have to do. Sometimes when you don't have very much wind, the millers have to actually put sailcloth on the sails. Well, they have to bring that sail down to this reefing stage, it's called, and then they use that lattice work just like a ladder. So the miller basically goes out and climbs up the lattice work, and the sailcloth is stored under the green and brown board, so he will pull that across and tie it with a rope. So each one of those sails has to be done if they need all four, or they could do two. So they have to be balanced, so they would either be doing 2 or 4. That's exactly what our millers do across the street. They go out, they climb up, they pull the sailcloth over and tie it. Now, when the Dutch are here and they're working on our windmill, they're out there climbing around in their wooden shoes. We don't have any of our millers that wear wooden shoes when they're out there climbing around on those sails, and I think it's probably a good idea. Mrs. Helema did all of the decorating of the windmills. She actually needed to show thatching here and here. She actually cleaned coconut shells and made it look like thatch. Our next mill is from France. And I think it would have been a real pain in the neck to have to put the sailcloth on this one, because the miller needed 2 pieces of sailcloth for every sail. And what he had to do here was he had to weave that sailcloth in and out from the bottom to the top, and then the second piece he started on the other side and came all the way down to the bottom. So if he had to put on all 4 or take off all 4, it would have taken a good long time to do that. So I think this one would have been a real pain. But that's what they had to do in order to make it work. So sometimes they had to reef 2 sails, sometimes they had to reef all 4. Now the unusual structure on this one is behind there is located a ladder. And that ladder is what actually rotates the structure again. So again, the miller has to go out, lift the ladder, and then rotate the little house up on top as well as the sails. The gears for grinding here would be located in the cone shape, and then below is where the raw material as well as the finished product would be. And these little spouts, that's just to allow the water to drain off whenever they did happen to have rain. So that's a little windmill from France. They use this mill either for grinding grain or crushing grapes and making wine. Both would not have been done in one. They would have done one or the other. This is a sawmill. This one we asked Mr. Helema to build for us because there are only 4 of these left in the Netherlands. So we felt like it was a really important one to have. Well, your capstan wheel is back here. And again, when that gets rotated, this time the entire mill turns. So this is like a big lazy Susan down here. So when the wind shifts direction, the miller has to change position with the capstan wheel. This one would have been surrounded by water. Basically, the miller would float the logs right up beside this platform. And on the other side, there is a winch. So they would actually drop the cable down, tie it around the logs, and then elevate those logs to this platform. Well, this is called a sled or a cradle, and the miller could actually fit 2 logs in it, one here and a second one here. If you look in here, you'll see there are some vertical saw blades, and there would have been a second set here. So basically, as the wind powered that log through that vertical set of saw blades, it would cut the log into several pieces of lumber simultaneously. So the Dutch went from a 2-man handsaw to this machine, which really improved their efficiency by 3,000%. So this particular mill really launched the Dutch into shipbuilding. This mill took Mr. Helema 1,000 hours to build. We actually paid him $22,000 for this, but we felt that was a real deal. 1,000 hours, $22,000. That included all of the materials, all of his time, all of his labor, bringing it here and setting it up. And we've done very little to it in the few years that we've had it. Some of us who worked on getting the funding for this, for donations, call it the cookie mill, because we had a lot of bake sales for this one. This mill is from Greece, and you'll notice it has a different kind of sail. And each one of those sails has to be manually adjusted. So depending on how much wind, depends on how much of the sail is actually visible. But each one of those comes down, the spoke comes down to the bottom, and the miller either rolls it up or unrolls it. Again, depending on how much wind they actually have. That's called a Mediterranean sail. So that one is from Greece, still functioning there yet today. This one that also has the same kind of sail looks a little bit different, doesn't have quite as many sails. This one is from Portugal, and it too has the sail that has to be brought down to the bottom, and each one of those has to be individually rolled up or rolled down. You'll notice behind on that one, there actually is a tail pole, and that pole that's behind is what the miller actually uses to rotate that sail into the wind. The one from Greece does not have to be rotated because where that sits on the sea, that actually receives wind all the time. So the only modification the miller has to make there is with the sailcloth. But on the one from Portugal, that does have to be manually rotated and those sails turned into the wind. The third one that we have here is actually one from the Netherlands, and it's rather unusual also. You'll notice on the bottom floor, inside, there are 2 big circular pieces. Inside each circle, there is a set of wheels. Those wheels roll around inside that circle, and they are constantly turning. So they are crushing whatever you put beneath them. So it might be seeds like linseed to get the base for paint, or you might crush mustard or cinnamon to get the spice. But that is a very unusual kind of mill. There are only 3 of those that still exist in the Netherlands. So that's a very unusual kind of windmill, but still in existence. And we actually have, and one of the things that they also made was snuff. And the Dutch really liked their snuff. So we actually have samples of some of the spices that were ground in that kind of mill, as well as some snuff. Next one that we're going to show you is one from Great Britain. And this one actually is a bit different. You'll notice, first of all, the sails are different. They are made of wood. And there actually is a chain over on the right-hand side. The miller simply pulls that chain, and that opens and closes that shutter. So he no longer has to crawl around out there and put the sailcloth on. The other unique feature on this one is up behind. You'll notice there is a fantail. And that fantail actually catches the wind, and that automatically rotates that cap and that sail, so there's no need for a capstan wheel any longer on this particular one. So the English found some really good modifications to make to the windmill and make it more usable and easier for the miller. This is a mill from Belgium. What you'll notice is that this is built on a brick foundation. The reason for that is the water table in Belgium was also very, very high. So when it was just the wooden frame sitting down in all that moisture, it would get soft and it would rot, and the mill would list or sometimes totally topple over and then be totally useless. So putting it on that brick foundation gave it stability as well as sustainability. You'll notice that on the second floor, there are 2 sets of grinding stones. When I turn it on, the one on the left, you'll actually be able to see the grinding stones rotating. Another unique feature on this is toward the top, in the back, there's a circular piece. You'll notice that that's going to turn, and then it will pause. And then it will turn, and then it will pause. That was to allow the miller the opportunity to grab the bag of grain off of the sack hoist and not have to stop the windmill in the process. Here's the capstan wheel on this one. Very, very small, but that turns that entire mill. In the interior also, I mentioned the sack hoist. You'll notice that on that second floor, you'll see that that rope continues down to the ground. The reason for that is the miller would actually tie that rope around his bag of grain, and then using the power of the wind, that would elevate it up through a couple of trap doors. The miller then did not have to haul his bag of grain up this very, very steep set of steps. If he didn't have the sack hoist, that would be his way to get the grain up to the top. This is another 800-hour project for Mr. Helema. Now, if you were going to take your grain to the windmill to be ground, you would have checked the position of the sails on the windmill before you left home, because that would give you information about what was happening at the windmill as well as what was happening in your community. So if we look at this little mill on the right, which is from France, that one, by the way, is called a tower mill, and it would have been made of either stone or masonry. It also has another couple of features that are unique. They don't do anything from the exterior on this one. This one's called an inside winder because they rotate the cap and the sails from the interior, and they open and close the sails. Notice the sails on that, very, very long wooden shaft. But back to the language of the sails. If you looked at that sail, you'd say, oh no, someone has passed away. That sail is called going. And you'll notice the very top sail is headed down. So you'd know something sad has happened in your community. As I said, either a death or an accident. We've actually positioned our sail across the street in that very position, I think 7 times since we opened, because we've had 7 different millers who have passed away. So that one is called going, and again, the mill itself is from France. The mill in the middle is one from England. A couple of things to notice before we talk about the language of the sails. Notice that has a fantail behind, and it also has a rail. Now that rail would have gone 360 degrees around the base of that windmill, so the fantail and the rail would keep that one turned automatically at all times. Back to the language of the sails. The top sail on this one is headed toward the 12 o'clock position. The sails always go counterclockwise. So that top sail is approaching 12 o'clock. That sail would tell you something good is going on in the community. There's a birth, there's a wedding, there's an anniversary, something celebratory. So you would be expecting good news when you get to the windmill today. So that's the one from England. The one on the left is one from Finland. Now notice that that one is positioned in an X-like position. That position would tell you, don't go to the windmill today because the miller is not grinding. So if you're out of flour, you're out of luck today. And again, that has almost solid sails, just a little bit of area there that you could put sailcloth on. So that one, again, is from Finland. The one directly across the way, the black and white one, is actually one from England. If you saw those sails set in a plus-like position, that would tell you the miller is not grinding temporarily. So maybe he's having lunch, maybe he's taking a nap, Maybe he's doing repairs. Hang on, he will be back in action a little bit later. You just need to keep waiting and watching. This is another mill from Finland, and you'll notice it has 6 solid wood sails. Again, not a lot of wind there, so they had to have that more solid sail all the time. You'll notice it has a tail pole behind, and that again is how they would actually rotate that cap and sail into the wind. If you look at it, some people think it looks like an outhouse on top of a log cabin. I can't disagree, so I guess they could decorate them however they chose to do that. So that's one from Finland. The one in the middle is another one from the Netherlands, and you'll notice here there is an auger or an Archimedes screw, and over here there's a trough. So the Archimedes screw is going to pull a lot more water than that first little water mill that we had at the very beginning, and then the trough is going to direct that to where you want it to go. Probably a large body, like a canal or a river or a lake for the holding area there. Bottom parts are stationary on this one, except for the auger. But the little house up above does rotate 360 degrees. So another very important water mill from the Netherlands. Here again, we have another Greek mill. This one is built right into the hillside. They didn't have a lot of wood in that country, so they tended to use their own natural resources as best they could. So many of those are made from a plaster-like substance, or sand at least. This is a mill from the Netherlands, and it's a repurposed windmill and a repurposed building. The mill itself was built in the late 1700s, and in 1950, they converted it from a grain mill to a mustard mill. So they now produce mustard in the mill. They have their mustard business below, and they live in the other portion of the building. So that mill has been functioning for years and years and years, and you'll notice it there on the wall, on the picture, and that's actually in an open-air museum in Amsterdam, right outside of Amsterdam, still functioning yet today, called Zanzeskans Park. The one in the middle is from Germany, and you'll notice the height on that one. In Germany, they had to be very tall because of the trees, the hills, and the mountains. So it was not unusual for them to be 7, 8, or even 9 stories in height. Again, it has the shutter for the sails, a capstan wheel behind, but the height is a very important feature on that particular one. And again, that entire body is made from thatch. This is the mill from England, and you'll notice it's a very, very old model. Doesn't have any sailcloth on it, doesn't have a regular large capstan wheel. It has a wheel behind it. Sometimes it would actually hook an animal to the wheel, so the animal would help with the rotation of that cap and the sail. But again, the miller would have to climb up to put the sailcloth on this, so that's an early English mill. The mill on the right is one from Ireland. That's called a tower mill, and again, it would have been made either from stone or from masonry. That too has a tail pole, and that tail would actually be rotated around the base, and that would rotate the upper structure of the cap and the sails. Hank left that one cut away so we can actually see the underpinnings of that sail, and it basically was a wood structure underneath the thatched cap. Built in 1817 in Wexford, Ireland, is still functioning today as a grain mill in Wexford, Ireland. The one in the middle, I think, is probably Mrs. Helaman's finest contribution. That mill is from Denmark. She needed to show slate shingles. The woman actually took manila file folders and pinking shears, cut each one of those, glued them one on top of the other from the base to the very tip top, very evenly, I might add, painted it gray, was not happy with how it looked. She put a whitewash over the top of that, still didn't think it looked good enough. The woman took a pencil and outlined each one of those little jags that she had made with the pinking shears. I said to her, "My heavens, how long did that take you?" And she said, "A very long time." She didn't keep track of her time like Hank did on his, but I think that just is a marvelous work that she put that all together. And again, you can see, if you look at the window on the door, This is the actual picture of the window that's on the actual mill. And I think she did a very fine job in replicating that. So she had a real critical role in this entire group of mills. And the last little one here is called a tasker, very unusual looking mill. Doesn't look like it would function at all, but it does. And they still are using some of those yet today. Again, it has an axle, and then it has your blade, and it has the Archimedes screw in the interior. Could be used either as a grain mill, or as a draining mill, or as a water mill. So they could either irrigate with it or they could do drainage. And as I said, still using some of those yet today in the Netherlands. So a very unusual mill. It's called a tasker. These are the Helamas that are responsible for this entire collection. As I said, Hank grew up in the Netherlands and then immigrated ultimately to the United States, actually twice. And he and June lived in Belgium, and they made this collection while they were living there. The story with them is rather unusual, but we'll talk about Hank a little bit first. His love of windmills came from this windmill. His grandparents lived in the northern part of the Netherlands, and whenever he and his family got to go visit, he made a beeline across the road to that windmill because he was so fascinated with it. So that was his first windmill love. He actually was a rather good student, but he said he didn't like school and he probably could have done better. And when it came time for him to actually go to college, World War II broke out. And the college that he wanted to go to was taken over by the Nazi soldiers. So that was really sort of out for him because the college closed. So he actually went to work. His father said, I guess you'll just go to work with me, which he did in the coal mines. His father was in management at the mine. But Hank had to work in the mine itself. And he said he dug and dug and dug. And he said, I hated every minute of it, but I did not have a choice. Well, one day his aunt, who lived in the northern part of the Netherlands, wrote to the family and said, I know a former professor who'd be willing to tutor him underground. Well, his parents thought that sounded like a great idea. So they put him on a train, headed north to his aunt's home. But the train got stopped in the middle of the country, and 120 young men were taken from that train to a forced labor camp in Wolfsburg, Germany. Hank wound up in a Volkswagen plant making Jeep parts for the Nazis. Not happily, but that's where he had to be. That was his assignment. Well, he said the woman who was the supervisor in that line was a very kind person, and she had the ability to grant an occasional pass for 2 hours on Sunday when they weren't working in the factory, and they could go into the German village, which was nearby. Hank earned a pass, went into the village, and he said, I did what everybody else did. We went to the tavern and had a glass of beer. But he said, I decided if I ever got another pass, I would do a little bit of exploration. And he really wanted to get out of there. Well, he got another pass, and he remembered that his father had worked with somebody in the coal industry. And he said, I decided I would try to find that man. Many, many months later, when he got another pass, he was able to locate the man, and he asked him if he would help him escape back to the Netherlands. Well, the man ended up saying, well, I'm of German descent. I need to be supportive of what's going on here. And Hank said, well, I'm not, and I'd like to go home. Well, the man said, you know, you'll be shot if you're caught. Hank said, I understand that. And he said the man hemmed and hawed a little bit, and then he finally admitted that he really was not terribly supportive of what was going on in the Netherlands. So he said, I will help you. He went home and got a hay wagon, and he had a friend who had a car. So they used the car as a decoy. They put Hank underneath the hay, and those two vehicles went down I guess it was probably the canal area. And when he found a place that he thought was safe, he let Hank out. Hank got back to the Netherlands, much to the surprise of his family, but he had a problem because when he went to the forced labor camp, they gave him new identification papers. They were for Germany. So now he's back in the Netherlands with German papers, and he said, if the Nazis find me here, I'm done. So his family had to prepare a hiding place for him. They actually heated their home with wood and peat, and they had a pile of that in the backyard. They ended up digging a hole, putting a chair inside, rearranged the wood and the peat so it looked like a wood and peat pile. So whenever the Nazis came down the road, family members would have to detain them long enough for him to get out of the house and into his hiding place. And he said that went on for months and months. And he said, finally, a neighbor that we trusted said, Hank, why don't you just join the Dutch Marines? You probably would get new shoes, you'd get some new clothes, and you'd get to go to the United States to be trained as a Dutch Marine. Hank signed up. The Dutch sent him to Camp Lejeune. From there, he went to Quantico, Virginia for officer training, and then the Dutch sent him to Indonesia. And he was there well after the war was over. When he finally got back to the Netherlands, he had malaria. Took him a year and a half to get over that. He got some training, and he ended up being able to come to the United States after World War II. He immigrated to the DeMott, Indiana area because he had an uncle who had immigrated there after World War II. Well, Hank ended up working for a rail car company in the Chicago area. And he worked there for about a year and a half, and he said, then I decided, God, the interstate highway system was becoming pretty prevalent. Working for the rail car company might not be in my best interest. So he ended up switching positions. They immediately sent him back to Europe because he could speak 6 languages fluently. So he and June ended up living in Belgium. That's where the company sent them. He decided to take her to that forced labor camp in Wolfsburg, Germany, where he had been detained in the forced labor camp. And right outside that village, there is an international wind and water mill museum. This museum is fashioned after that one. That one is the only one in Europe. We believe we probably are the only one in North America. So they started building mills while they were living in Belgium. When he ultimately retired to DeMott, Indiana, and they built a home, they brought the windmills with them. In their 80s, they decided they were never going to have that museum that they hoped to have, so they decided they would find some place for their mills. So they Googled windmills on the internet. They visited 5 locations. They went to Holland, Michigan, which has the last old windmill that was ever allowed out of the Netherlands. They went to the Batavia, Geneva, Illinois area, and on Highway 31 on the Fox River, there's an old German mill. Now that one was restored by Dutch builders probably 10 years ago or more, but they don't grind there any longer. They went to Pella, Iowa, and Pella has a Dutch windmill, newer yet than ours is. They went on to Elkhorn, Iowa, which has a Danish windmill that's probably been there at least 75, 85 years. We were their last stop. They were in our community for 2 days, checking us out. We had no idea we were being checked out. Well, the second day they were here, they came, and all we had at that point was the windmill. They came to the windmill, and the people in the gift shop recognized them and said, you must really like our windmills. I think you were here yesterday. And they said, well, we do, but we think you might like our windmills. So they invited us to come to DeMott, Indiana and check out their windmill collection. So 2 people went over, came back and said, we need to think about this. So 3 of us went over and looked over the windmills and said, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. What's the catch? Well, they said, you have to have a building, and it must be environmentally controlled. You have to control for heat, light, and humidity. And you can only move the mills one time. You can't take them and put them in storage. You need to have the building ready to move the mills into. Well, we said we only have two problems. One, we don't have a building, and two, we don't have any money. And they said, well, we know that the Friends of the Windmill raised money to get the grinding stones for the windmill, and you raised about $180,000, and then you sent 10 people to the Netherlands to learn how to operate those mills. If you tell us that you will raise money and write grants like you did for the windmill, we will wait for you. They waited for us, and we have their collection. Initially, we got 21 windmills from them. They brought 18 from Belgium when they first came back and had built 3 more. Then we purchased the 22nd from them, cleaned out their basement in 2015 and opened this building. Well, Hank went home and started building more windmills. So before he died, he had built 13 additional windmills to add to the 22 that we already had. So I will show you some of those. The first one on the top up here, the brown one, is from Russia. And you'll notice it's all a wood structure. And again, that has a very long tail pole. So that's another Russian mill. The one right above us is one from France. And that's called a tower mill. And notice that right above the door, there's a little window, and there's a statue in there. Well, there's a story with that one. The man who was constructing that windmill was having a terrible time finishing it. And he finally said, I'm sure the devil is involved. I'm going to make a deal with the devil. And he said, devil, if you help me get this completed, I'm going to call it the Devil Mill. So he was able to complete the construction. But if you'll notice, right above the door, there is a little statue. That's the Blessed Virgin Mary. That was put there to scare the devil away. So that's the story on that little French mill. The one in the middle is another one from Bridgehampton, New York, one that is still standing there yet today, built in 1868. And the one that's right before the post is another one from Belgium. And you'll notice that that has street lights around the base. That actually was intended to provide the wind power to light the street lights. So hopefully someday we'll get those street lights going. So that's a little one from Belgium. Underneath is the last old mill on Cape Cod, the little gray mill. Again, it's like an 1868 vintage mill, still standing yet today, but it is the last mill on Cape Cod. And the last 3 are either from Germany or from the Netherlands. And you'll just notice that each one of those structures is a bit different. There's a tower-type mill. There's the belt molen, much like ours, across the street. And then there's the little spider mill, the one at the end. This is actually Hank's very first model. And it took him another 800 hours to complete this one. This one is one from the Netherlands. It's called a hollow post mill because there's a big post that goes up through the center. It does have a capstan wheel for actually rotation. And again, they have to put the sailcloth on each one of those sails individually with climbing up. So it's called a hollow post mill, or another term sometimes is a spider mill. And again, 800 hours to build this one. The last one is up above the door, and that has its own tail. That is a replica from the reefing stage, or that white fence up of the mill across the street. That was actually built by the builders of our windmill. The base is the only different part. The story on that is there was a dentist in Clinton who was getting ready to retire. His wife said, "You need to get a hobby." So she gave him a camera. Well, our windmill was being constructed at that time right out here on the street. And so he was over here every day taking pictures during the construction phases. Well, he befriended the 2 young millwrights that were working on the windmill. And they had such a close relationship that periodically he would have them actually come to his home for dinner. Well, on the day of the dedication of the windmill, the owners of the company came, as well as the builders that were here. And this gentleman was in the audience, and one of the owners of the company that built the mill became ill on stage. and everyone thought he was having a heart attack. Well, this dentist was in the audience. He went to the stage, and he was able to communicate with the old Dutchman, who didn't speak a lot of English, but he could speak German, and this dentist could speak German. So they ended up taking him to the hospital in Clinton, and this person had surgical rights at the hospital, so he helped get him registered and in. And as I said, they thought he was having a heart attack, but it turned out he was an undiagnosed diabetic. So it took about a week to get him regulated on medication. This dentist was with him periodically throughout every day of the entire week that he was hospitalized. So before the old Dutchman got ready to go home, he said, "I will send you a windmill." So the first year we were open across the street, we didn't have the grinding stones. We had to purchase the grinding stones separately. And they were installed 1 year after we opened. Well, in that container with the grinding stones was this windmill. Now the dentist thought he was getting a little table model windmill. So much to his surprise, here was this huge thing. Took it to his home in Clinton, put it in his backyard, and a few months later, unfortunately, there was a windstorm, and the mill fell over. Well, there was some damage to it, not extensively, but some. So it sat there. A few weeks after that, this person the dentist was killed in a car accident. And a few weeks after that, his widow called the city and said, "I just hate to see this windmill sitting here damaged. If there's any way you can use it or repair it, please come and get it." So the city went over, got it, took it down to the Public Works building. Some people refurbished it. Well, then when we opened this building, we were walking around doing a punch list, and somebody said, "Oh my gosh, look at that space up there. What are we going to put up there?" And a Public Works officer was here that day, and he said, "We got this old mill down at the Public Works office. We'd be real glad to get rid of it." Got it, and it just fit. So it's another blessing for us that we actually were the recipients of that windmill as well. So it's a replica again. We've been very fortunate that people have shared stories with us from the Netherlands or things that happened with windmills. A couple more World War II stories that I know. One of the gentlemen that we had in our community speaking a couple of years ago was a child growing up in the Netherlands. And his father worked at The Hague, and he was in food service. Well, when the Nazis occupied the Netherlands, they kept him on in that role, but his duties were to find food for the soldiers or the German officers. Well, this young man was about 4 years old, and his father took him almost every day with him when he was searching for food. And he actually had a little pull along behind the bicycle that he rode all the time. And his child rode in that bicycle. Well, what the Nazis didn't know was that this young man's father was part of the underground. And not only had he been searching for food for the Germans, but he had been transporting new identification papers for people, primarily Jewish people. Well, he kept them under the child's blankets in this little pull-along cart that he had behind his bicycle, or under the child's clothing. And he said, we often got to checkpoints where we had to stop as well. And he said, if it looked like we were going to have to stop for any length of time at all and maybe be searched, my father would signal me and I would tantrum. And he said, no officer or no checkpoint wanted to hear a squalling, screeching child, and they would let us go right on through. So they transported a lot of important information for people who were looking for new identities. Another story from that same person was that he had saved some sunflower seeds, and he would put those out on his porch every morning, or I guess it was the top of a porch, and the pigeons would come, and they would lay eggs. And that was part of the food that those people ate during that time when they were being starved, basically. 30,000 Dutch people lost their life to starvation. But I can't imagine eating pigeon eggs for breakfast or for any time during the day. One of the other things that we've learned is that very often people would house people for a short period of time in their home when they were looking for a new location for people who needed new identification, primarily Jews who were coming from other countries into the Netherlands. And one of the persons told us this story, that they had a false wall in their home, and they very often would hide people behind that wall. But particularly the Jewish people liked to sing and do their chants. And so that was noisy. And very often they would find people because they were singing or whatever. So this family made what they called a singing box. It was made from paper mache, and they covered this box, and then they cut holes in it so the people could stick their heads in and they could sing or do their chants, and you couldn't hear it from the outside. So there were some very creative kinds of things that went on during the occupation of the Netherlands during World War II. And we're grateful that many of those people have shared those stories with us.
What you've seen today is just a glimpse of what makes the Windmill Cultural Center such a special destination. These incredible windmill and watermill models represent cultures and history from around the world. If you're looking for a unique day trip along the Mississippi River, make plans to visit Fulton. Walk through the Windmill Cultural Center, explore the rich Dutch heritage of the community, and discover why people travel from all over to see this remarkable collection. Bring your family, bring your friends, and come experience a piece of global history right here in Fulton, Illinois.